Hello friends, I'm glad you're here tonight, ready to let your mind wander while history slowly unfolds like the turning pages of an old manuscript. Before we begin, I want to ask you something. Where are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? I always find it fascinating to imagine people lying in bed across so many different places in the world, listening to the same story, each in their own quiet space. Now, as you get comfortable, let's drift together into a past that was complicated, secretive, and full of contradictions. When we think of the Middle Ages, many imagine castles, knights, cathedrals, and markets filled with spices, fabrics, and bread fresh from the oven. But behind the stone walls and wooden doors, there were lives that rarely appear in the chronicles. One of those hidden lives was that of men and women who loved differently from what society expected. To be homosexual in medieval Europe was to carry a secret that could be both dangerous and deeply human, a truth that threaded itself quietly through taverns, monasteries, villages, and courts. Imagine a young man in a bustling town, perhaps in northern France in the 12th century. By day, he worked as an apprentice, maybe in a blacksmith's forge, hammering glowing iron under the eye of his master. The air smelled of smoke and metal, and his arms grew strong from labor. But in the evening, when the forge cooled and the streets grew quiet, he felt another kind of fire, one that he could not easily speak about. His heart would race not for the girl selling apples at the market, but for the other apprentice who worked beside him, their shoulders brushing in the heat of the forge. Such feelings had no easy place in a world where church bells reminded everyone daily of sin and salvation, where sermons warned of eternal punishment for desires considered unnatural. Yet history is never just rules written in stone. It is full of whispers, glances, and private moments. Despite strict laws and harsh sermons, people found ways to live with their truths. Some hid it so carefully that their lives seemed ordinary, while others took risks, trusting a lover in candlelit secrecy. Monasteries, for instance, were places of silence and devotion, but also of human closeness. Men lived together, prayed together, ate simple meals of bread, cheese, and pottage, and sometimes formed bonds that went beyond friendship. Whether these were seen as spiritual brotherhood or something more depended on the eyes that noticed and the willingness of others to look away. Food, after all, was shared communally, eaten from wooden bowls with wooden spoons. In villages, people might have eaten dark rye bread, cabbages, salted fish, and the occasional cut of pork if the harvest had been good. Meals were not just about survival, they were about community. And in those communal settings, where laughter mixed with the smell of stew and ale, there were always moments when glances lingered longer than necessary, when a hand brushed against another under the table, unnoticed by most but heavy with meaning for those who felt it. The danger was real. Laws against sodomy could lead to brutal punishment. Chronicles from Florence, Paris, and London record trials where men were accused, sometimes betrayed by jealous rivals or angry neighbors. But those same records, by their very existence, prove that such relationships happened often enough to be noticed. The louder the sermons shouted, the clearer it became that silence could not erase desire. And still, people found ways to laugh, to sing, to tell stories. Music drifted through taverns where traveling minstrels played lutes and fiddles. Men drank ale until their cheeks flushed, women danced in circles, and songs carried over cobblestone streets. For someone who lived with a secret, these moments of music and chaos might have been the only times when the burden of hiding lifted, even briefly. Imagine sitting in a crowded tavern, your heart racing because across the room, someone's eyes caught yours, and you knew, just for a heartbeat, that you were not alone in your desires. History rarely tells us these small details, because chroniclers cared more for kings, wars, and saints. But under the surface of every era are the lives of ordinary people, shaped by rules but never fully defined by them. The Middle Ages were no exception. And so, as we continue this story, let's wander deeper into their world, into the streets and homes, into monasteries and courts, and into the hidden lives of those who loved differently, quietly, and sometimes dangerously. As we move further into the winding alleys of medieval life, the world becomes richer and more complex. Picture a market day in a bustling town square, with merchants shouting their prices, children running underfoot, and the smell of roasting meat and spiced wine filling the air. Colors of dyed fabrics hang from wooden stalls, bright reds and deep blues standing out against the dull brown of woolen cloaks. Among the crowd, people jostle and laugh, their lives interwoven with gossip, trade, and quiet secrets. And within that lively noise, someone might catch a glance that meant something forbidden but thrilling. The eyes of strangers could be dangerous, but they could also be the start of a silent conversation. In the swirl of a crowd, when a hand reached out to test the softness of cloth or to accept a piece of fruit, another hand might brush against it just slightly too long. In a world where touch was usually practical, passing bread, carrying tools, guiding livestock, that kind of pause meant more than words. And sometimes, those fleeting moments grew into nights of whispered talk, shared fears, and risky affection. The church loomed over everything, both literally and spiritually. The great cathedrals rose above rooftops, their bells marking the hours, their stained glass casting colored light across stone floors. Priests and monks preached the dangers of sin, warning against desires that they themselves were not immune to. Some confessions, whispered in dark corners, were met with stern advice and prayer, while others brought harsher judgment. Yet, human nature remained stubborn. Just as hunger for food and thirst for drink could not be denied, neither could the pull of desire. And within cloisters, where men lived together in silence, or convents where women prayed side by side, deep bonds often formed that blurred the line between spiritual and physical longing. Meals were central to daily rhythm. The poor lived mostly on bread, porridge made from oats or barley, cabbages, beans, and whatever could be gathered from the fields or forest. Salted fish was common, especially on Fridays when meat was forbidden, and ale was safer to drink than water, since boiling and brewing killed impurities. In wealthier households, meals included roasted game, honey cakes, spiced wine, and delicate pastries filled with fruit. Around the table, laughter and conversation flowed, and for someone who carried a secret in their heart, these gatherings could feel both comforting and lonely. It was easy to smile, to nod, to join in the laughter, but deep inside, the thought of being truly known, truly seen, remained a quiet hunger as sharp as any pang of the stomach. Entertainment was another escape. Jugglers performed in town squares, troubadours sang of love and longing, sometimes between knights and ladies, but sometimes, if you listen carefully, the lyrics hinted at love between men as well. One famous poet of the 12th century, Richard de Fournival, wrote verses that skirted the edge of what was acceptable, celebrating passion in forms not entirely confined to convention. And across Europe, whispers told of nobles who kept companions not just for friendship but for love, shielded by wealth and power from the scrutiny that crushed ordinary people. But secrets had a way of slipping into the open. A jealous rival, an angry parent, or a spurned lover could speak a few words to the wrong ears, and suddenly everything changed. Punishments varied across regions. In some places, fines and humiliations were common. In others, harsh prison sentences or worse awaited those accused. Yet even with such risks, the stories survived, passed in coded songs, hidden in the margins of manuscripts, or remembered in rumors. What is striking is how human these lives were. Between prayers and punishments, between bread and ale, between sermons and songs, there existed longing, affection, fear, and courage. To love differently was not just a matter of identity, it was a negotiation with survival, a balance between silence and expression, between danger and joy. Imagine lying in a straw-filled bed at night, hearing the rain on the thatched roof, with your heart pounding not because of the storm outside but because of the secret lying beside you. This, perhaps, is what makes history so alive. Not only the grand battles or royal decrees, but the quiet moments that never made it into the chronicles. And it is here, in these hidden corners, that we can begin to understand what it truly meant to carry such a secret in the Middle Ages. The silence of history is often the loudest voice. Chronicles rarely spoke openly of men or women who loved differently, but when they did, it was almost always in the context of accusation or punishment. To understand what it meant to live this way in the Middle Ages, we have to step carefully into those fragments, not just as cold records, but as glimpses of fear, resilience, and survival. Picture a courtroom in a medieval city, not the grand halls of kings, but the smaller chambers of local authority. A wooden table, a scribe with a quill scratching onto parchment, a stern official seated beneath a painted cross. Accused men or women would be brought forward, sometimes trembling, sometimes defiant. The charges were rarely spoken plainly. Instead, coded words were used, phrases like the sin of Sodom, unnatural affection, or vice against nature. These terms carried enormous weight, echoing through sermons and laws, but behind them were simply human lives, full of emotions too complex to fit neatly into the language of condemnation. One of the most striking things is how accusations often came not from strangers, but from neighbors or acquaintances. A door left ajar, laughter in the wrong room, a jealous lover's revenge, such things could spark an investigation. And once suspicion began, it spread quickly, because to accuse another was to divert attention from oneself. People understood the danger so well that even the faintest rumor could destroy reputations. Yet within those same rumors lies proof that these relationships existed everywhere, behind shutters, in taverns, in monasteries, in castles. Punishments varied across regions. In parts of France and England, fines or public humiliation were possible, forcing the accused to stand in the marketplace wearing signs of shame. In Florence, records describe men being branded or exiled. In harsher cases, imprisonment or even death awaited those judged guilty. The brutality of the law was intended to erase the possibility of love outside the sanctioned norms. And yet, these punishments never succeeded in eradicating desire. They only drove it deeper underground, into coded gestures, hidden letters, and private oaths whispered in secrecy. Imagine, for a moment, a pair of lovers caught in such a dangerous situation. By day, they avoided suspicion, working hard, greeting neighbors politely, attending mass like everyone else. But at night, in the dim light of a single candle, they spoke of their fears and hopes, voices low, knowing that discovery could mean ruin. Each moment together was a gamble, yet also a victory against the silence imposed on them. Even if the chronicles remembered them only as sinners, their real lives were filled with laughter, shared bread, tender glances, and the courage to keep going in a world that denied their love. Food often played its part in these hidden moments. A gift of honeycomb passed discreetly, a slice of cured meat shared under the cover of night, a flask of ale poured for two when no one was watching. These simple exchanges carried weight far beyond their taste. They were acts of trust, proof of loyalty in a world where betrayal could come at any moment. Imagine biting into coarse bread and salted cheese, knowing that the hand that offered it was more precious than any sermon or law could forbid. There were, too, stories that slipped through the cracks of silence. Rumors of powerful nobles who surrounded themselves with trusted companions, relationships shielded by wealth and influence. At courts, where troubadours sang and poets composed verses, the lines between admiration, loyalty, and love blurred in ways that common people could only hint at. In some cases, the very same society that condemned a villager might quietly look away when a lord or knight displayed similar affections, revealing the deep hypocrisy woven into medieval life. What makes these stories compelling is not simply the cruelty of the punishments, but the persistence of life in spite of them. The Middle Ages were filled with hardship, plague, famine, war, and yet people still sought joy wherever they could. They laughed in taverns, danced at festivals, shared food around hearths, and whispered words of love in the dark. Against the backdrop of all this uncertainty, love, even forbidden love, became not just an act of defiance but a reason to endure. The deeper we look, the clearer it becomes that the medieval world was not one single story of repression, but a patchwork of contradictions. Laws that threatened death, poets who praised beauty in all its forms, neighbors who betrayed each other, and others who kept quiet to protect secrets. To live as a homosexual in that era was to exist within this constant tension, balancing fear with hope, silence with expression, danger with the unshakable need for connection. And through it all, the world continued. Fields needed plowing, bells rang from churches, markets bustled with trade. Life, in all its ordinary rhythms, went on. And within those rhythms, love found its quiet spaces to survive. The silence of history is often the loudest voice. Chronicles rarely spoke openly of men or women who loved differently, but when they did, it was almost always in the context of accusation or punishment. To understand what it meant to live this way in the Middle Ages, we have to step carefully into those fragments, not just as cold records, but as glimpses of fear, resilience, and survival. Picture a courtroom in a medieval city, not the grand halls of kings, but the smaller chambers of local authority. A wooden table, a scribe with a quill scratching onto parchment, a stern official seated beneath a painted cross. Accused men or women would be brought forward, sometimes trembling, sometimes defiant. The charges were rarely spoken plainly. Instead, coded words were used, phrases like the sin of Sodom, unnatural affection, or vice against nature. These terms carried enormous weight, echoing through sermons and laws, but behind them were simply human lives, full of emotions too complex to fit neatly into the language of condemnation. One of the most striking things is how accusations often came not from strangers, but from neighbors or acquaintances. A door left ajar, laughter in the wrong room, a jealous lover's revenge, such things could spark an investigation. And once suspicion began, it spread quickly, because to accuse another was to divert attention from oneself. People understood the danger so well that even the faintest rumor could destroy reputations. Yet within those same rumors lies proof that these relationships existed everywhere, behind shutters, in taverns, in monasteries, in castles. Punishments varied across regions. In parts of France and England, fines or public humiliation were possible, forcing the accused to stand in the marketplace wearing signs of shame. In Florence, records describe men being branded or exiled. In harsher cases, imprisonment or even death awaited those judged guilty. The brutality of the law was intended to erase the possibility of love outside the sanctioned norms. And yet, these punishments never succeeded in eradicating desire. They only drove it deeper underground, into coded gestures, hidden letters, and private oaths whispered in secrecy. Imagine, for a moment, a pair of lovers caught in such a dangerous situation. By day, they avoided suspicion, working hard, greeting neighbors politely, attending mass like everyone else. But at night, in the dim light of a single candle, they spoke of their fears and hopes, voices low, knowing that discovery could mean ruin. Each moment together was a gamble, yet also a victory against the silence imposed on them. Even if the chronicles remembered them only as sinners, their real lives were filled with laughter, shared bread, tender glances, and the courage to keep going in a world that denied their love. Food often played its part in these hidden moments. A gift of honeycomb passed discreetly, a slice of cured meat shared under the cover of night, a flask of ale poured for two when no one was watching. These simple exchanges carried weight far beyond their taste. They were acts of trust, proof of loyalty in a world where betrayal could come at any moment. Imagine biting into coarse bread and salted cheese, knowing that the hand that offered it was more precious than any sermon or law could forbid. There were, too, stories that slipped through the cracks of silence. Rumors of powerful nobles who surrounded themselves with trusted companions, relationships shielded by wealth and influence. At courts, where troubadours sang and poets composed verses, the lines between admiration, loyalty, and love blurred in ways that common people could only hint at. In some cases, the very same society that condemned a villager might quietly look away when a lord or knight displayed similar affections, revealing the deep hypocrisy woven into medieval life. What makes these stories compelling is not simply the cruelty of the punishments, but the persistence of life in spite of them. The Middle Ages were filled with hardship, plague, famine, war, and yet people still sought joy wherever they could. They laughed in taverns, danced at festivals, shared food around hearths, and whispered words of love in the dark. Against the backdrop of all this uncertainty, love, even forbidden love, became not just an act of defiance but a reason to endure. The deeper we look, the clearer it becomes that the medieval world was not one single story of repression, but a patchwork of contradictions. Laws that threatened death, poets who praised beauty in all its forms, neighbors who betrayed each other, and others who kept quiet to protect secrets. To live as a homosexual in that era was to exist within this constant tension, balancing fear with hope, silence with expression, danger with the unshakable need for connection. And through it all, the world continued. Fields needed plowing, bells rang from churches, markets bustled with trade. Life, in all its ordinary rhythms, went on. And within those rhythms, love found its quiet spaces to survive. The monastery was one of the most powerful symbols of the Middle Ages, a place where silence, prayer, and devotion shaped the rhythm of life. But within the stone walls, among the echo of chants and the flicker of candles, there were also very human stories. To imagine what it was like for someone who carried forbidden desire inside such a world is to glimpse one of the most profound tensions of the era, the collision of faith and flesh. The day in a monastery began before sunrise. Bells called the brothers to rise from their straw beds, their breath visible in the cold air of unheated dormitories. Wrapped in woolen habits, they moved silently through the corridors, the sound of sandals on stone echoing beneath vaulted ceilings. In the chapel, the first prayers of the day rose in unison, Latin words flowing like a river, asking for purity, forgiveness, and strength. Yet for some, as voices merged, their eyes wandered, not toward heaven, but toward the figure standing beside them, the familiar curve of a face illuminated by candlelight. Meals in the monastery were simple: bread baked from coarse grain, vegetables grown in the cloister garden, fish caught from nearby rivers. Meat was rare, forbidden on most days. The brothers ate in silence, a reader reciting passages from scripture while wooden spoons scraped against bowls. Yet even in silence, communication found its way through gestures, a glance across the refectory, a hand brushing another's when passing a loaf of bread. Desire in such a setting was dangerous, but it was also almost impossible to eliminate because closeness was unavoidable. The very design of the monastery, with shared dormitories, communal prayers, and constant togetherness, created an environment where bonds could deepen far beyond friendship. For women in convents, the experience was much the same. Nuns devoted their lives to God, caring for the sick, teaching children, copying manuscripts, and maintaining gardens. Yet within their secluded walls, attachments grew as naturally as ivy on stone. Letters from later centuries, preserved despite efforts to destroy them, reveal deep affection between women, written in words of devotion that blurred the line between spiritual love and earthly desire. These letters did not always speak explicitly, but in their tenderness, their longing, and their careful metaphors, we hear the voices of women who found connection in a world that told them such feelings were sinful. The Church itself spoke with a divided voice. Official doctrine condemned homosexual acts as sinful, drawing on biblical passages and theological arguments. Preachers thundered from pulpits about the dangers of lust, warning that it threatened not just individuals but the entire community. Yet at the same time, some spiritual writers described relationships between men in glowing, affectionate terms, using language of love to speak of brotherhood. Saints were celebrated for their intense friendships, their devotion to one another, and though modern readers might interpret those bonds differently, the words reveal how blurred the boundaries could be. In the gap between doctrine and daily reality, human affection continued to exist, half hidden, half acknowledged. But the monastery was not a place without consequences. There are records of trials within religious communities, where accusations of forbidden acts brought shame and expulsion. Imagine the fear of being discovered, of knowing that one jealous whisper could unravel a lifetime of devotion. Yet even here, secrecy and loyalty provided protection. Brothers defended one another, sisters shielded each other, because in the end, they all understood that humanity could not be fully contained by rules written on parchment. Outside the monastery walls, villagers carried their own burdens. The church's teachings filtered into daily life through sermons and festivals, shaping how people thought about sin and virtue. But even for peasants who toiled in muddy fields, human closeness was not something they could simply turn off. After long days of labor, after evenings of sharing ale by the fire, their desires followed them into sleep, into dreams, into whispered moments with those they trusted. The more society condemned, the more carefully people learned to cloak themselves, building layers of secrecy that made every shared glance or word feel charged with risk. And yet, festivals often cracked open those layers. Feast days brought music, dancing, and masks, opportunities for release. Young people sang songs full of double meanings, daring each other with bold laughter. In those moments, when ordinary order dissolved, men danced with men, women with women, and the strict lines blurred under the sound of fiddles and drums. What began as play could sometimes reveal deeper truths, hidden beneath the surface of everyday life. The story of being homosexual in the Middle Ages is not only one of repression, but also one of resilience, invention, and the search for spaces where desire could breathe. Whether in a cloistered monastery, a quiet village, or a crowded marketplace, human beings found ways to be themselves even when the world around them demanded silence. And as long as there was song, laughter, food, and the unshakable need for love, those hidden lives endured, leaving behind faint but undeniable traces in the great fabric of history. Even in the grandeur of medieval courts, desire had a way of slipping quietly between the folds of velvet and silk. The castles, towering over towns like stone mountains, were not only centers of power but also spaces of subtle human drama. Lords and knights, surrounded by advisors, servants, and companions, lived under a constant gaze, yet found ways to cultivate relationships that could not be spoken aloud in public. Rumors circulated like sparks in dry straw, whispered along corridors, exchanged in the hushed tones of servants or jesters who knew more than anyone realized. A glance shared between two knights during a joust, a lingering touch as armor was removed, a quiet conversation behind tapestries. These were the hidden codes of affection. In one court, perhaps in northern Italy, a young page watched the prince from afar, learning his duties, carrying messages, sweeping the corridors. The prince's laughter was warm, his anger sharp, and yet when the day ended and the halls emptied except for the flickering torches, a small door would open into private chambers. There, the page and the prince shared stolen words, whispered jokes, and a closeness that no chronicler would dare write. Outside, the world knew only protocol, tournaments, and diplomacy. Inside, intimacy existed quietly, a fragile bubble against the judgment of history. Feasts amplified both danger and delight. A banquet hall, decked with carved wooden chairs, tapestries depicting hunting scenes, and tables heaped with bread, roasted meats, fruits, and spiced wines, became a stage for subtle interaction. Nobles competed for favor, showing off skill with a knife or lute, yet beneath the revelry, eyes met in secret understanding. Servants, musicians, and attendants learned to read the cues. A hand on a shoulder held longer than necessary, a smile exchanged between unlikely pairs, a token of bread or wine passed unnoticed by the others. Every gesture, every shared laugh, was a small act of defiance and intimacy. And then there were the rumors, those stories that history preserved not in official documents but in letters, diaries, and gossip. One nobleman might be said to favor companions of the same gender in private, though publicly he maintained the appearance of a traditional household. Stories of lovers hidden behind secret doors circulated for decades, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes based in truth, but always leaving traces of lives that existed outside the rigid boundaries imposed by religion and law. These stories, often whispered in taverns or passed among courtiers, were warnings, temptations, and entertainment all at once, showing the complicated web of human relationships in a society that demanded conformity. For common people, intimacy also found subtle ways to survive. The crowded streets of a village were noisy with carts, shouting merchants, and children chasing chickens. Yet even in such ordinary chaos, secret alliances and tender gestures thrived. A blacksmith and his apprentice might share a moment of closeness as the hammer rose and fell, sweat mixing with dust. Women who fetched water together from the river might linger, laughing, their hands brushing under the bright sun. Life required work, prayer, and obedience, but it also required love, in whatever form one could safely find. Festivals and carnivals provided moments when the ordinary rules were suspended. Masks covered faces and identities could shift for a night, allowing men and women to experiment with behavior that would be impossible on ordinary days. Songs full of double meanings filled the air, some humorous, some tender, some dangerously suggestive. Dancers embraced without worry, and the eyes of the crowd became shields for secret attraction. These temporary freedoms were fleeting, yet vital, allowing people to taste connection in a world otherwise governed by caution. Even as the centuries progressed, the tension between desire and danger never entirely disappeared. While punishments, moral teachings, and social expectations could intimidate, they could not erase the human need for affection. From the hidden chambers of castles to the narrow streets of villages, from the quiet cloisters of monasteries to the rowdy taverns of merchants, love found ways to survive. It adapted to the limits imposed upon it, learned to communicate in gestures, glances, songs, and whispers, proving that the human heart is not so easily contained. And so, as life continued with its rhythms of labor, worship, celebration, and secrecy, these hidden stories became the threads of a larger tapestry, an invisible map of desire, courage, and resilience, weaving through the stone and wood, the bread and wine, the music and laughter of the medieval world. The life of a medieval woman was a constant negotiation between labor, expectation, and hidden desire. From dawn until dusk, the days were filled with repetitive, necessary work, kneading dough for bread, tending vegetable gardens, collecting water from distant wells, washing clothes in cold streams, and mending garments patched with care. Yet beneath these routines lay a quieter, more personal world, one often invisible to men, chroniclers, or lawgivers. It was a world of fleeting touches, secret glances, whispered words, and coded letters. Imagine a young woman in a modest village in England. Her morning began with sweeping the hearth, stirring porridge over an open flame, and feeding chickens before the sun fully lit the sky. She might pass neighbors as she walked to the well, exchanging polite greetings, smiling politely, all while hiding the restlessness in her chest. Perhaps her attention lingered on another woman in the village, a seamstress with deft hands, hair tied in a braid, laughter that echoed softly when the wind shifted through the market stalls. The glance they exchanged might be brief, seemingly ordinary, but for them, it was an entire conversation spoken without words. Meals, although often simple, rye bread, cabbage, boiled beans, occasionally salted pork, were also moments of subtle intimacy. Passing a morsel under a table, sharing a drink in a shadowed corner, or exchanging a wink while performing a household task could convey emotions that words could not safely carry. Even work itself became a language. The way hands met when kneading dough side by side, the brushes of shoulders while hanging laundry, or the subtle coordination of movements in spinning or weaving offered opportunities for closeness. Every touch carried risk, and yet every touch also carried the thrill of connection. The church shaped women's lives profoundly, prescribing behavior and moral codes. Yet, within convents or cloistered communities, women experienced a different rhythm. Daily prayer, long hours of reading and copying texts, tending gardens, and serving the sick created a close-knit environment where friendships could deepen. These bonds often became intensely emotional, sometimes romantic in nature, though outwardly framed as spiritual devotion. Letters preserved across centuries hint at the intensity of these relationships: careful words, coded compliments, laments for separation, expressions of longing and admiration that went far beyond platonic friendship. Outside the convent, social gatherings offered both joy and risk. Markets, fairs, and festival days were filled with music, dancing, and the aroma of roasted meats and spiced pastries. Young women could share moments of attention and affection under the guise of games or festival songs, learning to read glances and body language to discern which interactions carried deeper meaning. Touches were subtle but meaningful: a hand resting momentarily on an arm, a shared laugh, a tilt of the head, or the quiet passing of a flower or trinket. The dangers were never far away. Gossip spread quickly, and the eyes of men, whether neighbors, priests, or officials, could turn curiosity into accusation. In some cases, penalties ranged from public shaming to fines or even exile. But for many women, the act of loving or connecting in these secret ways was worth the risk. Each fleeting smile, each whispered message, each quiet brush of a hand was a small act of resistance, a declaration of their own human needs. Even in daily labor, women found ways to express autonomy and agency. From the careful preparation of meals to the management of household finances, from tending livestock to spinning thread, they carved out space for themselves. Within those spaces, relationships could flourish in ways unseen by official history. Friendships could evolve into intimacy, partnerships could form over shared labor, and emotional bonds became a lifeline against the pressures and judgments imposed from the outside. And while much of the world demanded silence, women cultivated strategies to communicate safely. Coded letters, songs with hidden meanings, shared stories at night by the hearth, and the subtle language of gesture and glance allowed feelings to persist even when spoken words could have brought ruin. In every cottage, market, and workshop, the same delicate balance existed, between safety and expression, between fear and longing, between the demands of daily life and the quiet, enduring need to love. Thus, even amid toil, prayer, and social restrictions, the lives of medieval women were alive with hidden currents of desire and affection, forming an invisible tapestry woven through kitchens, gardens, convents, and village paths. And in these small, often overlooked spaces, the pulse of life continued, steady, human, and unbroken. Life in the medieval world was rarely simple, even for those who occupied seemingly ordinary roles. The village blacksmith worked tirelessly at his forge, hammering red-hot metal into tools and weapons, while his apprentice, often a boy barely out of childhood, watched with wide eyes, learning the rhythm of the bellows, the rise and fall of sparks, and the precision required to shape molten iron. Yet amidst the smoke and heat, quiet moments of closeness could emerge, unremarkable to outsiders but filled with unspoken understanding. A shared towel to wipe sweat from a brow, a hand steadying the hammer, or the unintentional brush of a shoulder could carry the weight of something far more intimate than labor itself. Meanwhile, in the kitchens of wealthy households, women orchestrated meals that were both work and art. The aroma of roasted venison, fresh-baked bread, and honeyed pastries mingled with the tang of herbs and spices imported from distant lands. Servants moved like shadows, coordinating each dish while maintaining a careful balance of hierarchy and discretion. It was here, in these bustling kitchens, that relationships were tested and formed. A glance shared over a bowl of cream, a small smile when hands accidentally met, or a whispered joke as they chopped vegetables. These fleeting moments, unnoticed by masters or overseers, carried significance deeper than any official approval could confer. Trade routes connected villages to towns, towns to cities, and cities to courts, bringing people from diverse backgrounds into contact. Merchants from Italy might converse with French traders in a mix of Latin, broken dialects, and hand gestures, while artisans displayed their wares, spun silk, carved wood, colored glass. In these spaces, anonymity could be both liberating and perilous. A traveling clerk might notice the way a fellow merchant's gaze lingered, a subtle exchange of gestures that could lead to private companionship during long nights of lodging. These encounters required both courage and secrecy, and they thrived in the tension between public appearance and private desire. Nobles, of course, lived under the strictest scrutiny, yet they too had avenues for affection that went unseen. In castles, relationships could form under the cover of etiquette. A shared ride on horseback through the forest, a quiet conversation in the garden, or an evening spent reading together by candlelight. The risks were enormous, as scandal could threaten not only reputation but political alliances. Yet despite the dangers, intimacy found its channels, whether through secret letters, discreet meetings, or the subtle language of gesture and touch. A hand lightly resting on another's, a meeting of eyes across a crowded hall, or the gift of a token, these small acts carried meanings that no law or sermon could fully suppress. Festivals continued to punctuate the rhythms of life. The air buzzed with the sound of fiddles, drums, and singing, and the crowd moved as one living entity. On such days, masks and costumes allowed individuals to step outside their ordinary roles, experiment with identity, and explore forbidden connections. A young man could dance with another in plain sight, the disguise of festivity granting fleeting freedom. Women, cloaked in flowing garments and decorated with flowers, could approach one another under the guise of merriment, their laughter concealing intentions that were all too clear to those attuned to the hidden language of love. Even the simplest gestures in these moments carried significance. Passing a cup of spiced ale, touching a sleeve to steady a stumble, exchanging a glance that lingered longer than socially acceptable, all of these became coded forms of communication. It was a constant negotiation. How to express longing without inviting punishment, how to maintain safety while sustaining connection, how to live fully in a world that demanded compliance yet could never fully extinguish human desire. And amid all this, life continued in its cyclical rhythms, the planting and harvesting of fields, the ringing of bells to mark prayer and labor, the preparation of food, the crafting of tools, and the unfolding of festivals. The medieval world was not merely a backdrop of fear and punishment, it was also a canvas for the quiet, resilient lives of those who loved differently. Peasant or noble, artisan or servant, cloistered monk or wandering minstrel, desire found its way, often hidden, often whispered, yet persistent and unyielding, like a river flowing beneath stone bridges and bustling marketplaces alike. Through work, play, celebration, and ritual, these hidden threads of life wove together a tapestry that was as real and enduring as any illuminated manuscript, revealing the pulse of humanity beneath the strict codes, sermons, and laws of the era. It was in the spaces between the lines, in the shadows of walls and halls, in stolen moments and careful glances, that the essence of medieval love, complex, dangerous, and deeply human, truly existed. The turn of the seasons shaped every aspect of medieval life, and with each change came its own rituals, celebrations, and opportunities for both joy and subtle intimacy. Spring brought renewal, fields tilled and sown, gardens planted, and rivers swelling with melted snow. It was a time of hope and new beginnings, when the air carried the scent of wet earth and fresh blossoms. Villagers worked tirelessly, yet even in the midst of labor, glances lingered, hands brushed, and unspoken understanding passed between those who dared to feel more than friendship. Children laughed and chased one another through meadows, and adults often found in those same meadows quiet corners where affection could exist away from prying eyes. Summer, with its long, golden days, was filled with sweat, toil, and celebration. Harvests demanded early rising and late evenings, yet they also brought bounty to tables, baskets overflowing with grains, fruits, and vegetables, roasted meats and poultry, honeyed cakes and fresh cheeses. In wealthy households, kitchens were alive with the clatter of pots and the movement of many hands, orchestrating a symphony of culinary activity. Amid the bustle, subtle gestures conveyed more than words ever could. A hand lightly placed on another's wrist, a shared laugh over a culinary mishap, the simple exchange of water or bread carrying a weight of trust and affection. Outside, festivals broke the monotony, filling towns and villages with music, dancing, and the vibrant chaos of carnival. Masks and costumes allowed people to step beyond ordinary social constraints. Men could dance with men, women with women, and the playful anonymity created temporary freedom from the rigid expectations of class and gender. Songs carried double meanings, often whispered in taverns or during games, and gestures became a secret language of desire easily understood by those willing to see. The subtle power of festivals lay in this brief suspension of normal order. For one night, the world was alive with possibility, and those who were normally silenced could laugh, dance, and touch without immediate consequence. Autumn carried a different rhythm, the pressure of harvests, the urgency of storing food for winter, and the quiet reflection of shorter days. Fields were alive with the rush of labor, while in kitchens, women and men preserved fruits and vegetables, salted meats, and brewed alesh that would sustain households through the cold months. In these quieter moments, hidden relationships found small sanctuaries. A shared task at the granary, the passing of a cup of cider, a joke exchanged over a crate of apples. These simple acts could sustain connection when more overt displays were impossible. Winter brought its own trials: frost-lined streets, bitter winds, and the scarcity of fresh food. Villagers huddled around hearths, sharing warmth, stories, and food. Meals were simpler but no less important. Coarse bread, pottage, and preserved meats provided nourishment, while ale or small amounts of wine offered comfort. In these long nights, conversations grew intimate, letters were written by candlelight, and small gifts, woven threads, carved tokens, or even a carefully chosen feather, became symbols of hidden affection. The cold outside made proximity inside more necessary, and warmth became a medium for subtle, meaningful connection. Throughout all seasons, music and storytelling threaded the fabric of life. Traveling minstrels carried news and gossip across towns and villages, their songs often concealing messages of longing or secret love in metaphor and rhyme. Tales of knights, heroes, and lovers blended with subtle hints of same-gender affection, allowing listeners to hear messages that society would not allow them to speak openly. In households and taverns, people sang and hummed in harmony, using melody to connect, to celebrate, and to console one another in ways that were both private and communal. Even the simplest gestures, unnoticed by many, carried profound significance. A smile that lingered too long, a touch under the table, a glance across the market stall, each could be a coded signal of understanding. Through all the labor, prayer, and ritual, these small acts of intimacy endured, hidden from official view but alive in the hearts of those who practiced them. The seasons dictated the rhythm of life, but human connection found ways to flourish within, between, and around those rhythms, resilient against both time and society's strictures. Thus, in every village, town, and castle, across festivals and quiet hearths, through labor and celebration, the medieval world was threaded with hidden currents of affection, desire, and courage. The ordinary routines of life, work, food, prayer, and music, were never neutral. They became the vessels through which love, in all its secret forms, persisted and endured. And through each turning season, each festival, each simple meal shared in quiet, the unspoken stories of desire carved themselves into the living landscape of the Middle Ages, invisible yet undeniable. Written words were one of the safest and most enduring ways to express desire in a world that demanded silence. Letters, often hidden between pages of mundane correspondence or tucked into folds of clothing, allowed lovers to speak in ways that could never be uttered aloud. A clerk in a northern town might compose a message to a fellow apprentice, using metaphors drawn from nature, the wind carrying scents of flowers, the moonlight reflecting on a stream, to hint at feelings too dangerous to declare outright. Every word was chosen with care, every sentence a delicate dance between honesty and concealment. Poetry flourished as another medium for hidden expression. Minstrels, traveling from village to town, carried songs that layered meaning upon meaning. A ballad about knights and ladies, read by one who knew the signs, could reveal love between men or between women, disguised within tales of loyalty and valor. Manuscripts, preserved in monasteries or private collections, sometimes included marginal notes, tiny symbols, hearts, or shorthand expressions that transformed otherwise innocuous words into intimate messages. Those who understood the code could read between the lines, while others would pass obliviously, unaware of the secret lives unfolding in ink. Even official documents occasionally provide glimpses. In Florence and other Italian city-states, records show men writing to one another about companionship, loyalty, and trust, using terms like beloved friend or my heart's companion. The language was formal, constrained by social norms, but the subtext was unmistakable. Likewise, letters between women in convents speak in metaphor about longing, absence, and shared devotion, their words carefully veiled yet charged with emotion. These texts reveal the persistence of desire and connection even in spaces dominated by religious expectation and strict codes of conduct. Tokens and small gifts accompanied letters, reinforcing the bond between sender and recipient. A carved wooden charm, a feather pressed between pages, or a piece of cloth embroidered with initials, all served as evidence of attention and care. Even mundane objects could carry secret meaning. A cup placed in a particular spot, a loaf of bread shared under the table, or a knitted piece of cloth left in an unnoticed corner. In a society obsessed with hierarchy and propriety, these small acts became lifelines, proof that affection existed and could survive despite the world's strictures. Music and song complemented written communication. Troubadours and minstrels carried coded verses from court to court, village to village. Lyrics that appeared to celebrate friendship or loyalty could carry layers of meaning intelligible only to those who understood the nuances of language and custom. A line praising beauty might subtly suggest attraction. A repeated phrase might signal longing. Through song, individuals connected across distances and social boundaries, maintaining bonds even when physical meetings were impossible. Yet letters and songs were not always safe. Intercepted correspondence could lead to punishment, and writing in code was a necessary precaution. This risk only heightened the intensity of emotions. A secret discovered might lead to disgrace, exile, or even death, yet the act of expressing desire, even subtly, was irresistible. The very danger gave these communications a power, making each carefully crafted word or symbol an act of defiance as well as affection. Beyond letters, daily life carried its own coded messages. A glance across the market stall, a hand lingering for a moment too long, the positioning of objects in shared spaces, all became part of a hidden lexicon. People learned to read these signs, which gestures were safe, which conveyed intimacy, and which were signals of trust or invitation. This quiet literacy, practiced across villages, towns, and courts, allowed secret connections to thrive even under constant social scrutiny. And so, across centuries, through words written in candlelight, songs sung by wandering minstrels, and gestures shared in shadowed corners, the secret lives of medieval men and women endured. Each communication, each token, each verse or phrase carried weight beyond its apparent meaning, becoming a bridge between longing and expression, fear and courage, secrecy and intimacy. The persistence of these hidden bonds proves that human connection cannot be fully controlled or erased, even in the harshest of times, and that desire, in all its forms, continues to flow through the quiet spaces of history. Even the most powerful and influential were not immune to whispers. In royal courts and city halls, gossip often carried as much weight as law. The lives of nobles, knights, and wealthy merchants were scrutinized not just for political maneuvering but for personal associations, and rumor could strike as quickly as a dagger in the dark. Some whispers hinted at affection between men of influence, or between women whose social positions allowed them freedom to cultivate bonds that ordinary villagers could only dream of. Yet even within wealth and privilege, danger lurked. A single accusation, even unproven, could ruin a career, destroy alliances, or invite exile. In Florence during the 13th century, for example, records describe men brought before civic authorities accused of lewd acts with other men. The punishments varied: public humiliation, fines, exile. Some were spared through connections, wealth, or strategic alliances, while others faced imprisonment or worse. Yet the very existence of these cases proves the persistence of desire, the inevitability of human connection, and the lengths people went to pursue intimacy even when laws and morals conspired against them. These were not anonymous individuals, but men and women navigating the same fears, joys, and secret pleasures as those in village cottages or bustling markets. Courts were a particularly complicated stage. A nobleman might be expected to marry and produce heirs, to participate in tournaments, to manage estates, and yet privately maintain discreet relationships that defied societal norms. Servants, companions, and pages could become confidants and lovers, navigating hierarchies while sharing intimacy in ways both exhilarating and perilous. These relationships required skill, timing, and careful observation. A touch that lingered too long could spark suspicion, a letter discovered could mean ruin. Even in opulent settings, the tension between public expectation and private desire created a precarious existence. One lived with constant vigilance and strategic discretion. Women of status, too, navigated perilous terrain. A lady of the court might cultivate alliances with other women through correspondence, secret gatherings, or shared leisure in gardens and galleries. Poetry, music, and art allowed subtle expression. A painting might include gestures understood only by those familiar with the symbols. A poem might contain coded words of admiration or longing. Outside observers would see nothing more than politeness, friendship, or refinement, but within these exchanges thrived emotions both real and daring. Even among common folk, the same mixture of desire, secrecy, and risk persisted. In towns and villages, rumors could destroy reputations, yet small acts of intimacy, holding hands, exchanging trinkets, lingering conversations, persevered. The line between friendship and love often blurred, and people became experts at reading the unspoken language of glances, gestures, and coded phrases. Every market day, every journey to the well, every shared task in fields or workshops was also an opportunity to communicate silently, to nurture bonds, and to defy the rigid expectations of society. Festivals amplified these tensions. At masquerades, carnivals, and feast days, anonymity allowed interactions impossible on ordinary days. Men danced with men, women with women, identities blurred, and the constraints of social hierarchy became temporarily irrelevant. A gesture, a look, a shared song. These small acts could carry immense significance, offering a taste of freedom in a world that often demanded conformity. For nobles and commoners alike, these fleeting liberties were moments of profound human expression. Despite the ever-present risk of discovery, the human desire to connect remained unstoppable. The same medieval world that imposed fines, exiles, and moral condemnation also produced letters, poems, tokens, and gestures that kept affection alive. Power, wealth, or social position could mitigate some risks, but none could fully eliminate the need for intimacy, nor could society entirely suppress the coded conversations that allowed hidden lives to flourish. History, in its dry records and chronicles, remembers punishments, accusations, and scandals, but beneath those lines lie the quiet stories of persistence. Nobles and peasants, men and women, clerics and artisans, all navigated the same complex currents of desire, secrecy, and courage. In markets, kitchens, gardens, courts, and cloisters, intimacy persisted, subtle yet unbroken, threading through the rigid structures of medieval life, leaving traces that survive even when names and faces have been lost to time. Travel in the Middle Ages was rarely simple. Roads were rough, often muddy or overgrown, and journeys took days, weeks, or even months. Yet these long, uncertain travels created spaces for encounters that would have been impossible in the static environment of villages or courts. Merchants, pilgrims, and messengers traversed the countryside, stopping in inns and taverns where strangers could meet, converse, and sometimes form attachments in ways hidden from prying eyes. In these transient spaces, anonymity and shared purpose offered freedom from the rigid hierarchies that otherwise constrained daily life. Picture a caravan moving along a trade route from Flanders to Italy. Wagons creaked under the weight of grain, cloth, and wine. Horses snorted, hooves stirring dust into the hot sun. Merchants exchanged goods and news in a mixture of Latin, local dialects, and gestures, laughter ringing through the air as deals were struck. Within this bustling network, subtle bonds formed, a hand brushing another while helping load a crate, a shared smile over a cup of water at a roadside stream, quiet conversations after the day's labor ended, often lingering well into the evening around a flickering fire. What outsiders would see as ordinary camaraderie could carry deep affection, connections that were both thrilling and dangerous. Pilgrimages offered another avenue for hidden intimacy. Devout travelers, moving from one shrine to another, faced long days on foot through forests, across rivers, and over hills. Inns along the way were crowded with fellow pilgrims, providing rare moments of privacy and closeness. Travelers could share meals of coarse bread, dried meats, and small coins spent on ale, all while passing knowledge, stories, and perhaps a secret glance or handhold that signaled something forbidden yet deeply human. The journey itself, with its hardships and shared purpose, amplified the intensity of relationships formed along the way. Even ordinary villagers sometimes journeyed beyond their homes for fairs, markets, or festivals in nearby towns. These trips allowed young men and women, tradespeople, and apprentices to encounter people from other regions, exchanging songs, jokes, or notes disguised as business correspondence. A traveling artisan might leave behind a carved token, a small embroidery, or a simple verse that spoke volumes to the recipient, all while appearing mundane to casual observers. In these fleeting moments of connection, lives expanded beyond the confines of local expectations, allowing secret desires to flourish in spaces that were both public and private. Merchants and artisans, especially those who moved seasonally or along established routes, developed intricate networks of trust. They carried letters, packages, and personal messages for friends and lovers, often under the guise of business. The passing of a sealed letter might seem ordinary to the untrained eye, yet for those involved, it could represent days of longing, careful planning, and emotional risk. Every interaction carried stakes. Being observed too closely, having a letter intercepted, or misreading a gesture could have consequences, yet the thrill of connection often outweighed the danger. Even couriers and messengers, constantly moving between cities and courts, became carriers of more than news or goods. They transported confidences, tokens, and coded messages, and in the process, formed their own relationships with travelers and recipients. On a cold night in an inn, a messenger might share bread with a companion, exchange a word or touch that spoke volumes, and then disappear with the dawn. These brief encounters, repeated over time and space, formed a network of clandestine connections stretching across kingdoms and regions, invisible to authorities yet alive in human memory. Through travel, trade, and movement, the medieval world revealed a surprising fluidity. Static hierarchies and local restrictions were momentarily suspended, and in those moments, human connection found fertile ground. Desire, affection, and companionship flowed along roads and waterways, in inns, marketplaces, and forests, bridging distances and defying social constraints. Life in motion allowed hidden relationships to flourish, and those who understood these rhythms became masters at balancing secrecy with expression, danger with intimacy. Thus, the world of the Middle Ages was never wholly static. It moved, it flowed, and within that motion, human connection persisted. From peasants on foot to nobles in carriages, from pilgrims to traveling minstrels, the act of moving through the world, carrying goods, messages, or simply one's own body along rough roads, became both a necessity and an opportunity. And in these journeys, the secret currents of love, desire, and courage continued, threading unseen through the landscape of medieval life, resilient, daring, and deeply human. Inns and taverns were the beating heart of medieval social life, places where travelers, merchants, and locals converged in a chaotic rhythm of clanging mugs, snapping fires, and the low hum of conversation. For many, they were necessary stops on journeys, providing food, shelter, and warmth, but for those seeking connection beyond the watchful eyes of family, neighbors, or authorities, they offered something far more valuable: opportunity. In the shadows of flickering torches and behind the clatter of plates and stools, glances were exchanged, subtle touches communicated longing, and conversations carried meanings hidden in the ordinary hum of hospitality. Picture a tavern along a well-traveled road, wooden beams darkened by smoke, the scent of roasting meat mingling with spilled ale and the earthy aroma of straw-covered floors. Merchants recounting deals, musicians tuning lutes and fiddles, travelers sharing stories from distant lands, it all created a lively atmosphere, yet amidst the din, people learned to navigate a secret language. A cup passed deliberately across a table, a hand resting lightly on an elbow, a brush of fingers under the guise of cleaning or passing a dish. These small gestures conveyed longing, trust, and desire, all while appearing entirely innocent to casual observers. Innkeepers themselves became unwitting participants in these delicate dances. Some turned a blind eye to discreet meetings, recognizing that the privacy they offered was part of the establishment's charm. Others subtly facilitated interactions. A room kept ready, a fire stoked in an isolated corner, a meal delivered with careful timing. The social economy of secrecy thrived in these spaces, allowing connections that could not exist elsewhere. For men and women alike, taverns provided the rare combination of visibility and invisibility, surrounded by people, yet free to inhabit a parallel world of subtle intimacy. Even in crowded city taverns, where artisans, laborers, and traveling entertainers gathered, coded interactions flourished. Apprentices might exchange quiet jokes, lingering touches during shared work, or playful dances that carried hidden messages. Women weaving or spinning nearby could pass small tokens, threads tied in particular knots, flowers hidden in folds of skirts, coins left in meaningful patterns. Every object and gesture had potential meaning, forming a secret lexicon of desire that was understood by those in the know, invisible to everyone else. Music and song amplified these hidden communications. Minstrels, whether hired or performing spontaneously, played tunes that carried double meanings, often narrating tales of love, loyalty, and secret longing. A fiddle's note, a drum's rhythm, or a line of verse could signal an invitation, a shared secret, or an acknowledgement of understanding between two people who could not speak openly. In these moments, the tavern became a stage for subtle drama, where social hierarchies, daily labor, and rigid moral codes were momentarily suspended in the service of human connection. Festivals held within these spaces heightened the intensity. Masquerades, games, and storytelling nights allowed even the most constrained individuals to explore relationships under a veil of anonymity. Masks obscured identity, laughter created cover, and music cloaked gestures. Men could dance with men, women with women, apprentices with traveling performers, creating fleeting but meaningful bonds that would be remembered long after the festival ended. These moments of freedom, though temporary, offered sustenance for the heart, proof that desire could persist even in an era of danger and strict social codes. Yet these interactions were never without risk. Gossip, overheard conversations, or misinterpreted gestures could lead to public censure, fines, or exile. The stakes lent every act of secret communication urgency, heightening the thrill and the peril. A subtle glance, a whispered joke, a touch in passing, all became charged with significance, combining affection, courage, and cunning. The tavern, in its seeming chaos, was a microcosm of the larger medieval world, full of danger, labor, hierarchy, and hidden intimacy, all intertwined in a delicate balance that required vigilance, skill, and daring to navigate successfully. Inns and taverns, though ordinary in appearance, were incubators of resilience, courage, and subtle human expression. Across the flickering shadows, among the smell of roasting meats and spilled ale, the hidden currents of medieval love, desire, and connection flowed freely, shaping lives in ways official records rarely capture. And in every glance, touch, and coded gesture, the quiet pulse of humanity persisted, a defiant and enduring testament to the need for connection in a world often structured to prevent it. Courts were as much theaters of human desire as they were centers of power. In grand halls with high vaulted ceilings, tapestries depicting hunts and battles, and sunlight filtering through stained glass, nobles navigated a complex web of loyalty, ambition, and affection. Every word spoken, every gesture made, every bow or glance could be scrutinized and misinterpreted. Yet within this delicate dance, secret relationships flourished, relationships that were as much a negotiation of survival as they were a pursuit of intimacy. A young squire might serve a knight whose reputation was unmatched, learning not only the skills of combat but also the subtle art of companionship. In public, they adhered to protocol, standing at attention, observing hierarchy, following the cadence of formal life. But in private chambers, in gardens hidden behind high walls, or in corridors dimly lit by torches, gestures carried meanings that were both forbidden and profound. A hand lightly placed on the arm, a lingering touch while fastening armor, a conversation that stretched long past the appointed hour, all became a language of secret desire, requiring careful timing and understanding. Mistresses and consorts, too, navigated the invisible currents of courtly affection. Women of high status often had few options for openly expressing desire, but they wielded influence in subtler ways. A carefully chosen gift, a private conversation in a secluded gallery, or an orchestrated meeting by the fountain could convey devotion and intimacy without attracting scrutiny. Courtiers became masters of reading gestures, glances, and tone, understanding that each interaction might hold hidden meaning. Even a shared laugh during a formal meal could carry undertones of longing or alliance, recognizable only to those attuned to the delicate codes of courtly life. Romantic intrigue in courts was rarely separate from politics. Alliances, marriages, and favors were entangled with personal desire, and the consequences of exposure could be severe. Letters were carefully crafted, often written in code or metaphor, delivered by trusted attendants, and read only by the intended recipient. Poetry, music, and art became vehicles for hidden expression, allowing individuals to communicate emotions that could not be safely spoken aloud. A lute's melody could carry a message of longing. A sonnet's words might disguise the true affection of the author. These coded communications threaded intimacy into the very fabric of courtly life. Scandal, of course, was never far away. Whispered rumors of forbidden relationships, misinterpreted gestures, or intercepted letters could ruin reputations overnight. Yet even scandal could be a tool, a form of leverage, or a way to manipulate political outcomes. Lovers had to navigate carefully. One misstep, one ill-timed revelation, could threaten not only personal safety but entire family fortunes. This constant tension between exposure and secrecy, risk and reward, shaped the rhythms of courtly relationships in ways that were both exhilarating and exhausting. Even outside the immediate circles of the throne, courtiers formed intricate networks of friendship and affection. Alliances and rivalries intertwined with personal attraction, creating a landscape where desire, strategy, and survival were inseparable. Private gardens, shadowed hallways, and discreetly positioned balconies offered spaces for conversations, meetings, and gestures that were invisible to the larger world. Every touch, every glance, every carefully selected word became part of a game, balancing intimacy and discretion, pleasure and danger. Travelers, visiting dignitaries, and envoys added further complexity. A fleeting meeting in a guest chamber, a shared meal, or a musical performance could spark connections that were both unexpected and impossible to formalize. Letters and gifts exchanged across miles reinforced these bonds, while the threat of exposure lent each interaction heightened intensity. In this world of etiquette, power, and constant observation, love and desire became a high-stakes game, requiring both cunning and courage. The lives of nobles, in all their grandeur, were threaded with the same human impulses as those of peasants, artisans, and pilgrims, yet magnified by visibility, risk, and consequence. Desire found expression through gesture, poetry, music, and coded messages, surviving even under the intense scrutiny of courtly life. Within this delicate web of protocol and intrigue, hidden bonds flourished, proving that human connection, whether through fleeting glances, whispered words, or secret rendezvous, was impossible to fully suppress, even in the gilded cages of medieval power. Artisans and performers moved through the medieval world with a rhythm all their own. From the early hours of dawn, the hammer struck metal, the loom wove intricate patterns, and brushes painted banners destined for town halls and churches. Life was hard, laborious, and often monotonous, yet within these routines, moments of intimacy and connection thrived, subtle and alive. Apprentices and journeymen learned their craft side by side, hands brushing over tools, eyes meeting across workbenches, smiles shared over shared mistakes, and laughter spilling quietly over the clatter of daily toil. In these ordinary acts, affection grew in the quiet spaces, unnoticed by supervisors but deeply felt by those involved. Traveling performers, jugglers, minstrels, acrobats, and storytellers offered a different kind of freedom. Constant movement from town to town allowed them anonymity, granting opportunities for fleeting but meaningful connections. In the inn or tavern, after performances ended and applause had died down, private corners became spaces for conversation, touch, and shared laughter. A musician might pass a small token to a fellow performer, a juggler might linger near a companion, and through these gestures, intimacy was expressed in a world that often denied public acknowledgement. The shared experience of performance created a closeness that was at once practical and deeply personal, blending survival with emotional fulfillment. Even the simplest trades carried potential for connection. A weaver exchanging materials with another artisan, a potter assisting a fellow craftsman, or a merchant sharing stories during a long journey all became opportunities for subtle communication. Touches that seemed incidental, glances that appeared accidental, and laughter shared over work tasks carried layers of meaning. In workshops and markets, artisans learned to read these signs carefully, understanding which gestures indicated friendship, trust, or deeper affection, and which could lead to suspicion or trouble. Feasts and town gatherings offered additional opportunities for interaction. The aroma of roasted meats, fresh bread, and spiced wine filled the air, while music and dancing created spaces where the ordinary rules of propriety could bend, even if only for a night. Men and women of lower social status, whose lives were otherwise confined to labor and survival, found freedom to explore gestures and expressions of desire under the cover of noise and revelry. Masks, costumes, and the chaos of festival days allowed glances to linger, hands to meet, and messages to pass in ways that were impossible during ordinary days. Letters and small tokens remained important even for these itinerant groups. A note slipped into a package of cloth, a carved wooden charm tucked into a bag, or a carefully placed flower could convey meaning far beyond the object itself. These exchanges required thought, subtlety, and courage. Discovery could lead to shame, conflict, or danger, but the act of communicating desire and affection was irresistible. For those constantly on the move, these small rituals formed a network of connection that spanned villages, towns, and regions. Even outside inns and taverns, the medieval landscape offered secluded spaces, forests, riverbanks, abandoned mills, and gardens hidden behind walls. Here, travelers, artisans, and performers could meet without observation, exchanging words, touches, and tokens safely. These moments were often brief, fleeting, and intensely charged, yet they became memories, sustaining connections across distance and time. The mobility of these individuals allowed them to maintain relationships that might have been impossible in a static, hierarchical society. Through all this, the pulse of medieval desire remained resilient. Whether among nobles in their courts or artisans in their workshops, among traveling minstrels or village laborers, the human need for intimacy found expression. Glances, gestures, letters, songs, and tokens became the language of hidden lives, and through these, affection persisted even under social scrutiny. Life in motion, whether through work, travel, or performance, was not merely survival. It was a medium for connection, creativity, and courage, threading invisible lines of love and desire across the medieval landscape. Religious communities, convents, monasteries, and abbeys were often perceived as bastions of strict discipline, prayer, and moral rectitude, yet within their walls, human emotion and desire persisted, quietly and intensely. Daily routines were structured around the ringing of bells, the rhythm of prayer, and the work necessary to sustain the community, tending gardens, copying manuscripts, preparing meals, and maintaining the cloister's order. Yet beneath these routines, relationships flourished in forms often invisible to the outside world. Affection, admiration, and love expressed themselves in gestures, glances, and letters, careful not to breach the rigid expectations imposed by vows and authority. In a convent, a novice might spend hours at a loom beside an experienced sister, their hands occasionally brushing over threads, fingers meeting in subtle touches that were easily dismissed as accidents. Conversation flowed in hushed tones during work, the cadence of words carrying warmth and intimacy understood only by the participants. Even shared meals, taken in silence and punctuated by careful gestures, offered opportunities to communicate without speaking. The act of reading aloud from sacred texts or copying illuminated letters could be a pretext for prolonged proximity, stolen glances, and whispered confidences. Letters within religious communities were particularly potent. Carefully folded and hidden between pages, or passed discreetly between hands, they could express longing, admiration, or deep friendship in coded language. Metaphors drawn from nature, rivers flowing together, stars mirrored in one another's eyes, flowers opening in hidden sunlight, allowed feelings to be communicated safely under the guise of spiritual or educational reflection. Poems written in margins, small sketches of intertwined hands or subtle symbols, and the exchange of modest tokens like ribbons, threads, or pressed flowers carried meanings invisible to the uninitiated. Even the most ordinary daily tasks could become channels for intimacy. Cleaning the chapel together, tending the infirmary, preparing meals, or organizing the garden allowed subtle touches and quiet collaboration. The long hours of shared labor created bonds that were both emotional and practical, grounding relationships in mutual reliance and shared experience. The rhythm of daily life itself became a medium through which affection could be expressed and sustained, blending the sacred with the personal in ways that were neither openly recognized nor entirely suppressed. Ceremonies, too, offered opportunities for connection. Processions, feast days, and communal prayers provided structured gatherings where proximity was required, yet individuals could communicate subtly through posture, eye contact, and gestures. Even singing in choir or reciting psalms allowed for a shared experience that deepened bonds. In the stillness of cloisters, the quiet of libraries, and the hidden corners of gardens, emotional and romantic connections persisted, weaving a hidden tapestry beneath the outward discipline and order. For monks, too, the struggle between desire and duty was present, though often expressed differently. Shared labor in scriptoria, tending livestock, or performing maintenance created opportunities for quiet conversation, subtle encouragement, and careful companionship. In cloisters, the long hours of reflection, labor, and prayer were punctuated by interactions that could convey loyalty, friendship, or affection without violating the strictest boundaries of communal life. The tension between duty and longing shaped daily rhythms, creating relationships that were intense, private, and enduring. Even the risk of discovery could not entirely extinguish human connection. The fear of punishment, censure, or removal from the community heightened the value of each gesture, each letter, each shared smile or touch. In these constrained spaces, creativity and subtlety became tools of survival as well as tools of connection, allowing affection to flourish in forms both enduring and carefully veiled. Desire, patience, and courage intertwined, proving that even under strict religious discipline, the pulse of humanity, longing, connection, and intimacy remained resilient. Through cloisters and monasteries, as through villages, courts, and taverns, the medieval world reveals itself as a landscape of hidden currents. Daily routines, labor, study, and prayer were not merely obligations. They became the canvas upon which the subtleties of human desire were painted, often unseen but profoundly alive. In every brush of a hand, every lingering glance, every carefully folded letter, the quiet defiance of personal connection persisted, threading life with resilience, courage, and the enduring need to love. In the quiet expanse of the countryside, daily life moved at a rhythm dictated by the seasons, the weather, and the work required to sustain life. Fields stretched across hills and valleys, tilled by peasants who rose with the sun to tend crops, herd animals, and repair fences. Children ran through the meadows, chasing one another between haystacks, while women gathered water, milked cows, and baked bread over open hearths. Amidst these ordinary tasks, hidden lives thrived, unnoticed by neighbors but palpable to those attuned to subtle signs of affection, longing, and desire. A pair of villagers might meet during the shared labor of planting or harvesting. Hands brushed while tossing seeds, fingers lingered as they passed baskets of grain, and laughter echoed across fields in ways that spoke of familiarity and unspoken connection. Shared toil created intimacy, standing close to shelter one another from the sun or rain, offering a towel to wipe sweat, or passing a cup of water across the line, all gestures carrying meanings that went far beyond their immediate practicality. Village gatherings amplified these connections. Market days brought people together from surrounding hamlets, and the chaos of trade, animals, and conversation allowed fleeting yet meaningful encounters. A glance across the stalls, a smile exchanged over a bartering dispute, or a brief conversation about prices and goods could be a pretext for building deeper, private bonds. Fairs and seasonal celebrations added music, dancing, and games, creating spaces where social hierarchies loosened and hidden desires could surface under the cover of merriment and movement. Even the humblest homes offered moments of closeness. In cottages lit by the warm glow of hearth fires, families gathered around simple meals of pottage, bread, and preserved vegetables. Within these walls, subtle expressions of intimacy flourished, leaning close to converse quietly, exchanging glances while performing chores, or offering a small token of affection such as a ribbon, a carved piece of wood, or a pressed flower. For women, these gestures often passed unnoticed by men and children, forming a private lexicon of love and friendship that persisted beneath the surface of everyday life. The natural landscape itself provided hidden sanctuaries. Forest paths, riverbanks, and secluded gardens allowed couples to meet discreetly, away from prying eyes. A stroll through a wooded lane might carry the weight of anticipation. A hand resting briefly on a companion's arm could convey devotion. A conversation beside a flowing stream could hold words that would be too dangerous to speak elsewhere. The countryside, while vast and open, offered privacy in its nooks and corners, enabling relationships to thrive despite the scrutiny of village life. Even casual objects carried meaning. A basket of freshly gathered herbs left on a doorstep, a loaf of bread delivered to a neighbor, or a bouquet of wildflowers tucked into a sleeve could signal attention, admiration, or desire. In a world where public declarations of love were fraught with risk, these small tokens became the lifeblood of hidden connection. They allowed affection to survive, to be acknowledged in subtle, shared understanding, and to flourish in ways that were both courageous and tender. Community rituals also shaped social interaction. Religious festivals, harvest blessings, and local fairs offered structured opportunities to gather, dance, and celebrate, all while creating the illusion of public observance. In these spaces, gestures, laughter, and shared stories could be coded expressions of intimacy. Men could hold hands or exchange words with men, women could brush fingers together while arranging flowers, and the busy distraction of communal activities provided a perfect cover for fleeting yet meaningful connections. Through fields, homes, festivals, and hidden paths, rural life became a tapestry threaded with intimacy and resilience. Daily labor, seasonal cycles, and social gatherings were not merely routines. They were vessels for secret communication, quiet courage, and enduring human connection. Love, longing, and desire persisted beneath the rhythms of work, the clang of tools, and the chatter of village life, proving that even in the simplest settings, the pulse of humanity could not be suppressed. Distance shaped the rhythm of affection as much as proximity did. In a world without modern communication, messages traveled slowly, carried by messengers, merchants, or travelers, and the anticipation of letters and tokens heightened their emotional value. A young man departing for work in a distant town or a merchant's caravan would leave behind a lover or friend, each carrying the weight of unspoken longing and carefully hidden desire. Every letter, every token, became a bridge across miles, a fragile yet vital lifeline sustaining connection in the face of absence. Communication relied on subtlety and discretion. Letters were folded, sealed, and often hidden within mundane correspondence. A request for supplies, a trade order, or an inquiry about livestock might conceal a poem, a confession, or a simple, "I think of you." Metaphor was essential. Words drawn from nature, rivers, mountains, sunrises, allowed the expression of longing and love while avoiding the scrutiny of authorities or nosy neighbors. A phrase about a river's flow might simultaneously describe separation and the hope of reunion, a metaphor understood only by those attuned to the code. Tokens reinforced these connections. A piece of cloth embroidered with initials, a carved figurine, a pressed flower, or even a particular type of feather could signify devotion, longing, or shared memory. These objects were portable yet deeply meaningful, tangible proof of attention and affection across distance. The act of receiving or giving such a token carried both joy and risk, for exposure could result in gossip, censure, or punishment. And yet the human desire for connection proved stronger than fear, compelling individuals to continue these exchanges despite the stakes. Travelers, too, became conduits for secret messages. Merchants moving between villages carried letters and small gifts. Itinerant performers relayed coded songs and jokes. Pilgrims transmitted poetry and stories. The network of movement across towns, fairs, and roads allowed relationships to persist, connecting people who might otherwise be isolated by geography and social constraints. Each journey was both physical and emotional, a vessel for longing, hope, and courage, and even the briefest encounters along the road could sustain a relationship for months or years. Even mundane objects could become messages. A loaf of bread sent with a merchant, a jug of ale left at a friend's doorstep, or a bundle of herbs delivered during market days could carry significance far beyond their ordinary purpose. The recipient would understand the hidden meaning, interpreting intention, affection, or reassurance. In a world where privacy was scarce and public scrutiny constant, these everyday items became instruments of intimacy and persistence, threading connection through ordinary life. The anticipation itself became part of the relationship. Waiting for a letter, planning the arrival of a token, or preparing a message for a traveler imbued daily life with heightened emotion. Work in fields, workshops, and kitchens took on a dual purpose. Labor was both survival and preparation for the next opportunity to communicate across distance. A farmer stacking hay, a weaver finishing a cloth, or a scribe copying letters all participated in this network of long-distance intimacy, their labor interwoven with affection, secrecy, and courage. Even in towns and villages where travel was more common, distance preserved a unique kind of privacy. Courtyards, market squares, and narrow streets allowed for meetings that were fleeting yet significant. A glance exchanged at a market stall, a secret nod across the square, or a shared joke while delivering goods became part of a living language of subtle communication, sustaining relationships even when physical proximity was limited. Through letters, tokens, travelers, and the natural rhythms of work and travel, love and desire transcended geography. The medieval world, though bound by distance, hierarchy, and social expectation, was threaded with networks of hidden connection. These threads carried hope, longing, and courage across miles, proving that human connection could flourish even in the spaces between homes, fields, and towns, and that distance, rather than erasing intimacy, often intensified its depth and significance. Marketplaces were alive with movement, color, and sound, a cacophony of life that could conceal 1,000 subtle exchanges. Merchants hawked cloth, spices, grain, and trinkets, while buyers haggled and children darted between stalls. Yet within this chaos, secret interactions thrived, weaving through the bustle like hidden currents beneath a rushing river. Lovers, friends, and confidants discovered opportunities in proximity. A brush of a hand while selecting produce, a lingering touch under the guise of counting coins, or a fleeting smile exchanged as eyes met across crowded lanes. Fairs amplified this delicate web of connection. Held seasonally, they attracted people from surrounding villages and distant towns, offering music, games, and performances that blurred the lines between strangers and acquaintances. Dancing, juggling, and storytelling created spaces where the ordinary constraints of social order loosened. Men could dance with men, women with women, artisans could mingle freely with travelers, and glances and gestures carried coded messages intelligible only to those in the know. Even a playful game or shared joke could be a pretext for flirtation, a signal of interest, or an acknowledgement of affection otherwise impossible to express. Urban centers, with their narrow streets, crowded squares, and hidden courtyards, provided a unique backdrop for clandestine encounters. Alleys offered brief privacy, rooftops allowed meetings out of sight, and gardens behind houses became sanctuaries where gestures, words, and tokens could be exchanged safely. The density of the city, while creating constant observation, also allowed anonymity. In the midst of a bustling crowd, a hand could brush another hand unnoticed, a whispered word could pass undetected, and a fleeting glance could carry the weight of longing and trust. Merchants and artisans, whose livelihoods depended on movement and interaction, often became adept at navigating this subtle language. A handshake could convey familiarity, a shared tool could carry a hidden message, and a carefully timed smile could communicate reassurance or desire. Even small objects, such as a ribbon, a carved trinket, or a folded note, became powerful instruments of connection, allowing love and friendship to endure in a society that demanded vigilance and discretion. Songs and performances added further layers to this hidden world. Minstrels traveling from town to town carried verses filled with metaphor, subtle references, and coded meanings that only attentive listeners could decode. A ballad about a loyal companion or a hidden hero could be in homage to a lover, a friend, or a secret admirer. In urban spaces, where music and storytelling were part of daily life, these messages moved through the air as whispers of longing, forming invisible bonds that stretched across streets, markets, and houses. Yet danger was always present. Laws, gossip, and moral scrutiny shaped every gesture, glance, and word. Accusations could ruin reputations, disrupt livelihoods, or invite punishment. The threat of exposure lent each interaction intensity. A secret smile, a carefully folded note, or a token hidden beneath a basket could be both thrilling and perilous. This tension between desire and risk sharpened perception, forcing individuals to become masters of subtlety, observation, and timing. In this environment, the ordinary and the extraordinary intertwined. Daily routines, shopping for food, carrying goods, negotiating prices, became opportunities for hidden expression, while festive occasions and performances allowed for more overt, though still coded, communication. Urban life, with all its noise, complexity, and surveillance, became a landscape where intimacy persisted, cleverly disguised, resilient, and profoundly human. Through bustling streets, crowded markets, and lively fairs, medieval people found ways to connect, to express longing and affection, and to maintain bonds despite social constraints. The human desire for intimacy, trust, and love thrived in these urban networks, a subtle but persistent current that threaded life together, invisible to most but deeply felt by those living within its flow. In the medieval world, desire and intimacy were rarely safe. Authorities, both secular and religious, monitored behavior with keen eyes, enforcing laws, norms, and expectations. Town criers announced proclamations, scribes recorded fines, and sheriffs patrolled streets, ensuring compliance with codes that governed morality, hierarchy, and conduct. In villages, gossip carried faster than official decree. Neighbors observed glances, interpreted gestures, and whispered suspicions that could travel from one end of a hamlet to another in a single day. This scrutiny transformed ordinary life into a delicate dance, where even the smallest movement could have outsized consequences. Punishments for transgression ranged from fines and public humiliation to imprisonment, exile, or corporal punishment. In cities, magistrates presided over trials for moral offenses, often using accusations as political tools. A glance held too long, a letter intercepted, or a token discovered could lead to public censure or ruin. Monks, nuns, apprentices, and nobles alike navigated this tension, balancing the human need for connection against the ever-present threat of exposure. In courts, scandals involving hidden relationships could destabilize alliances and reputations, while in villages, a single rumor could ostracize a family, forcing them to relocate or endure years of suspicion. Despite the danger, clandestine connections persisted. People developed intricate systems of secrecy, coded language, hidden notes, careful timing, and trusted intermediaries allowed communication to flourish even under surveillance. A hand held beneath a table, a subtle nod across a crowded market, or a folded verse slipped between pages could express devotion, longing, or reassurance without detection. These strategies required vigilance, cunning, and courage, transforming ordinary human interactions into acts of resistance and survival. Even the most seemingly mundane objects could become vehicles of hidden communication. A piece of cloth tied in a particular knot, a carved figurine placed in a specific corner, or a pressed flower tucked into a book conveyed messages invisible to outsiders. Merchants, travelers, and artisans developed networks through which these tokens and messages moved, sustaining bonds across villages, towns, and regions. Pilgrimages and trade routes became lifelines, allowing relationships to endure despite physical separation and constant scrutiny. Fear of exposure also heightened the intensity of connection. Each interaction, each letter, each token carried stakes that made the experience both thrilling and dangerous. A whispered word in a courtyard, a glance across a bustling market, or a touch under the cover of a cloak became acts charged with meaning, heightening both emotion and risk. The tension between desire and danger, intimacy and visibility, transformed daily life into a delicate negotiation where skill, timing, and perception were as crucial as courage. Law and society shaped behavior, but they did not extinguish human connection. Across courts, monasteries, villages, and urban centers, people found ways to communicate, to love, and to sustain relationships despite surveillance and censure. Secret gestures, hidden tokens, coded letters, and fleeting encounters created a hidden map of intimacy threading through the medieval world. These invisible currents connected nobles, peasants, artisans, performers, and religious individuals alike, proving that desire and affection could persist even in the most constrained circumstances. Ultimately, the medieval world was defined by tension between visibility and secrecy, authority and rebellion, risk and intimacy. Every glance, touch, word, and object carried significance, and the human drive for connection persisted, resilient and creative. Courts, inns, villages, and cities became arenas in which the pulse of human desire beat quietly yet insistently, threading life with courage, subtlety, and enduring affection. Even in a society governed by strict codes, moral scrutiny, and surveillance, love, longing, and secret connection flourished, proving that the human heart could never be fully constrained, and that intimacy, whether fleeting or enduring, was a force that shaped life in every corner of the medieval world.